I'm going to go ahead and broadcast it so people can start getting into the webinar.
Okay.
Welcome, folks. We have a few minutes before we start. I wanted to open up the webinar for y'all to get in. Today is the 4th installment of our Climate Smart webinar series. You don't have to have attended the previous ones to come to this one, though. We will be sharing on Facebook Live as well, so if you know somebody who didn't pre-register for the webinar who's interested in watching, they can head over to our Facebook page and watch it live. I have disabled the chat function, but feel free to type any questions into the Q&A. You should see a little button that says Q&A. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. It's right at 2 o'clock. So we're here for our Climate Smart Floridians webinar series, and we are streaming live on Facebook right now. So again, if you had somebody who wasn't able to register for the webinar who's interested in participating, they can go to our Facebook page and watch us live there. We're also going to be recording this presentation, so everybody that registered for the webinar will receive a recording after the webinar concludes today. We'll send out an email follow-up that you'll get either later this week or early next week. I do want to take this opportunity, though, to let Kim Barber from Manatee County Libraries say a few words. So Kim, if you want to jump in for a second.
Sure. As Alyssa said, my name is Kim. I'm with the Manatee County Libraries, and this webinar is a collaborative series between the Manatee Libraries and the UF Extension Services. And while the libraries are open to a limited capacity, we're still offering a lot of virtual programs, and you can check those out on our Facebook page or on the website. And I will turn this over to Alyssa.
All right, thanks, Kim. We have two more in this series. We're going to be talking about water and about landscapes. So check us out next week or the following week if you are interested. So what we're going to be talking about today, just real quickly, in case you're new to us, I think I looked at the participants list here in the webinar and I recognize all the names there. But for those of you out in Facebook Live land, what is Extension? We are a function of the University of Florida, which is one of Florida's 2 land grant universities. And our main mission is to take the research that's conducted at the University of Florida and at other universities throughout the country and throughout the world and bring that information down to the human level in our communities to try to make it accessible and to provide it in such a way that it enhances the quality of our life here in our community. So that's what we kind of do in a broad nutshell, but we have many different program areas within Extension. So my name is Alyssa Vinson, and I am our residential horticulture agent here at our office. That means that I work within our Florida Friendly Landscaping program, our Master Gardener Volunteer program. I also manage our Master Naturalist program and handle some natural resource type issues. We have a marine resources agent who focuses on coastal ecosystems and fisheries. We have an agent who specifically works on livestock. We have folks that work on water conservation and best management practices for landscape professionals. Our 4-H office is housed here at Extension. We also have the food and nutrition program that focuses on healthy eating choices in schools. So we really span a wide variety of topics here at Extension. And just to give you a little bit of insight into how our different program areas impact the community, you can see here, these are some of our impacts that we like to highlight. This is from last year. We had over $2 million in value for new licenses and CEUs provided to mainly landscape professionals. Over $860,000 was the value of volunteer time. And again, we have over 110 Master Gardener volunteers here in Manatee County, as well as having 4-H volunteers and some other volunteers that help out from time to time in the office. So this is a huge effort on behalf of these volunteers who donate over 10,000 hours of their time every year to provide education to our communities. Over 28,000 youth were educated through 4-H youth development and other youth programs. And then over 14 million gallons of water was saved to Manatee County's utilities customers. So again, we really span a really wide variety of topics. And these are just a few impacts that we like to highlight. The program that you're in today is the Climate Smart Floridians program. And Climate Smart was created, it's a curriculum that was created through the University of Florida's Sea Grant Climate Work Action Team. And this curriculum was made available to all extension agents throughout the state to be used to provide educational opportunities to our local communities to help people gain an insight into kind of actionable steps that they can take to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so today's discussion, we've talked about the broad picture. We've given the basis for the state of climate change here globally and specifically in Florida. We've talked about building and development and transportation and kind of what we can do from an energy perspective. Today we're going to talk about consumption and waste and how these two sides of the same coin really contribute to our annual global greenhouse gas emissions. And so some of the key learning points that we want to focus on today are going to be, avoiding some of those upstream emissions by curbing our consumption. How do we reuse items before we get to that recycling point? Only recycle as necessary. Compost organics as much as possible, and buy products that have post-consumer recycled content. Those are some of the key learning points that we're going to talk about. I want to first kind of put out a question. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And I've been doing some reading on kind of the psychology of all of this. But why do we consume? Why, as humans, do we feel it necessary to continue to gather things around us? And I think that there are many reasons for that, but one of the kind of driving factors of our current social structure and our economy is, we go to work. We go to work so we can make money. We make money so we can buy things, and we think that those things are going to make us happy. Right? If I have this thing, I will be happy. If I have this opportunity, I will be able to do this thing and I will be happy. And so I think that the main goal overall of consumption is generally happiness. Humans are searching for happiness. I think too, there's a little bit of kind of social hierarchy and some sort of preening going on. I think a lot about animals that like birds especially that like to gather little bits of things to try to attract a mate. And I think that it's kind of inherent in a lot of living things to try to gather kind of shiny objects to impress others. And so I think there's a little bit of that as well. But I'd like to ask you, if you would, to type into the Q&A for those folks that are here live in the webinar. For those folks that are watching on Facebook Live, you can type into the comment box, what is sort of a moment or a thing that you can think of that really made you happy for a really long time? I'm just curious to see, if we talk about consumption as a way for us to feel happy, what is something that's made you feel happy? And go ahead and type it here in the Q&A if you're here in the webinar, and in the comment box if you're live on Facebook. Let's see. Okay. Vacation. Wine. Good. Anyone else care to type in there? Okay, so somebody said plants, and plants. Happiness comes from enjoying nature. So somebody had a non-consumptive memory of happiness, being outside, enjoying nature. I like that I see there are 4 people who have responded plants. So that's good. That's good. I think that with the audience that we have today, that's kind of an expected answer, right? A lot of folks really enjoy puttering about in the garden, putting new plants in the ground, getting new plants. And I think that type of happiness that you get from seeing things grow and cultivation is really about a connection to something more primordial, a connection to the living things around us, a connection to kind of the natural cycles of life that we feel sort of separate from in our day-to-day experience. We talk a lot about nature deficit disorder, which is something that can be experienced by adults as well as children, right? We live in these kind of bubbles, and I think that gardening is definitely one of those activities that can bring happiness because you kind of get back into that that rhythm of life, so to speak. Gifts to family. That's a nice one. Somebody added in gifts to family. Yeah. So being able to provide good experiences to the people you love, that's something that definitely makes you happy too. So, okay. So I was just kind of curious about that. So, some of the reasons why we consume, but mainly I think it's this idea that if I have this thing, it'll be easier for me to do this, or it'll make me happy. So, in light of the reasons why we consume, I wanted to start first with a discussion on something that's kind of come up recently, and it's called fast fashion. And fast fashion is this idea that you can go to a store and buy an outfit for $30, right? that outfit might last you 6 months before it starts to get holes in it or the fabric wears thin. And then what do you do with that item? You're going to maybe give it to Goodwill, right? Or give it to some other kind of charitable organization, or you're going to chuck it in the bin, right? If it's got a lot of holes in it, if it's falling apart, you're not going to want to donate it because it's not going to be usable by someone else. So it's going to end up going into the landfill. And if you look here, the growth of clothing sales and decline in clothing utilization since 2000. So if you look here in 2000, you can really see that clothing sales have really dramatically increased over the last 20 years. And at the same time, the number of times people are wearing those clothes before they get rid of them is decreasing. So people are buying more and more clothes, and then they're not wearing them as many times before they get rid of them. And I think that you know, a lot of our consumption related to clothing is, you know, you got to have the new fashion, the new coolest thing, but then you want to keep up. And you also are able to do so because the clothing has gotten so much cheaper, right? But one of the reasons that clothing has gotten so much cheaper and more easily consumable has to do with the way that it's produced. And so, you know, we can talk a lot about kind of the waste aspect of fast fashion and the idea that we're ending up with tons, literal tons of textile material in our landfills that take, you know, approximately 80 years or so to break down. If we look upstream at the fashion industry, we can see that it's highly water intensive, and there's a lot of plastic consumed for a lot of our clothing. I know, you know, you can't hardly find a pair of women's jeans anymore that aren't stretchy in some way, so they have some kind of plastic in them. And there are lots of chemicals and greenhouse gases associated with the production of dyes and everything that goes into kind of manufacturing that clothing and then transporting that clothing from where it's manufactured to where it's ultimately consumed. So, you know, I really wanted to start us off by thinking about one of the first and easiest things that we do. You know, we pick out something to wear in the morning and we put it on. And while it might be really easy to go spend $5-10 on a new shirt, think about what's going to happen. What is the life cycle of that item? Where is it going to end up? Well, for the most part, a lot of this is going to end up here. You know, this is a pretty typical landfill. If we look at 2017 numbers, we're looking at around municipal solid waste generation of about 268 million tons of garbage that has to go into a landfill. You know, 67 million tons of that is recyclable. 27 million tons is compostable, and there's some energy combustion that's done. But of that total waste generation, you still have over around about 140 million tons of material that is sent to landfills. And we're gonna look at the breakdown of what material actually ends up in the landfill. And so if you think about the life cycle of one item, right? If you take I'm just going to take a plastic water bottle. If you take a plastic water bottle, that material has to be extracted, right? Plastic is made from petroleum. So petroleum is extracted from the ground, it's refined, it's turned into plastic, it's, you know, shaped, and then it is filled with water that is extracted from groundwater in some part of the world. It is then transported, who knows how many thousands of miles, to its end user, right? The end user is going to take that water, they're going to drink it, and maybe they put it in a recycle bin, okay, if we're lucky, or maybe it goes into the trash can if we're not so lucky. Even if it ends up in the recycling bin, there's no guarantee that it's ultimately going to end up being recycled and that plastic is going to be repurposed or melted down and reused. There are a lot of considerations that go into recycling plastics as far as the grade of the plastic, whether or not it's contaminated with other kinds of materials. It has to be a certain, has to be clean. And then there has to be a market for the reuse of that plastic. So if it's melted down and reused for some purpose, there has to be a market reason that makes that economically feasible for someone. So if we break that down even further, okay, we looked at 137 million tons of municipal waste created every year that ends up in landfills, right? Over 240 million tons just created. If we think about each person in the United States, approximately 1,300 pounds of trash per person per year. And if you break that down even more, you can look at kind of in pounds what people are throwing away. Newspaper is 38 pounds, aluminum cans is 28 pounds, clothing. And this is why I wanted to start us off talking about fast fashion, because when we break down that 1,300 pounds of trash that we create every year, the highest number there, that's 90 pounds worth of clothes that we throw away every year for the average person. And I know, you can't donate underwear and socks, right? But you can turn them into rags and you can reuse them in your house for cleaning your windows or cleaning your floors. Cardboard boxes is another one, especially now in this day and age where we're getting a lot of items delivered to our homes. The amount of cardboard boxes that are ending up in trash is really increasing. So how does this connect to climate change, right? I think we can all acknowledge, or we've heard about the issues with waste and consumption previously. But how does this relate to climate change? So if you think here, you're looking at something that's being produced. You have the original inputs, right? Materials extracted, trees, ore, oil, petroleum, things like that. There's energy that goes into the raw materials acquisition. There's also energy that goes into the manufacturing of those items. So if you think about just a tree that's going to be harvested and used for paper towels, sustainable forestry is absolutely a thing, and I highly recommend, if you're going to use paper products, use sustainable forestry products. But let's think about, you have a machine that's out there burning petroleum products to cut down the tree, right? The tree goes on a truck or a train, burning petroleum products to get to the location where that wood is going to be pulped. That pulp wood is then going to probably be transported again to a manufacturing site where it's turned into paper. That paper is then going to be trucked or trained, burning petroleum products to get to the distribution center, where it is then going to be trucked to the location where it's to be sold, right? So if you think about, you have extraction, manufacturing, transportation, that's all creating carbon dioxide emissions and other associated greenhouse gas emissions. Even when we have recycling, right, there still is some amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with that recycling process, right? We have to separate those materials. We have to grade them in different classes according to their type. Those materials are then transported sometimes they're transported out of our country, right? There's been a lot of coverage in the news about the lack of ability to kind of send or sell our recyclable materials to other countries, but that was very common for a long time. We would use this product that was recyclable, we'd put it in the recycle bin, it would go to a sorting facility, and then it would go from that sorting facility to China, and they would process it over there, melt it down, turn it into something else, right? So there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions even associated with that recycling process. Now, if we think more about things like composting, composting does a little bit better job of kind of capturing the CO2, putting it back into the carbon cycle, back into the soil. And we'll talk more about composting in a little bit. But when we talk about things going into the landfill or things going into the municipal solid waste generation systems, you know, really the best thing to do is to not have it go into that cycle, to not have it end up, you know, leaving your house as a product that's considered waste. Because once it gets into that stage, there are a lot of associated greenhouse gases. If you can keep it on site or make sure that it ends up in a composting facility, if it can be composted, then that carbon's going to get stored in the soil and not released into the atmosphere. So that's a good thing. But otherwise, with landfilling and with recycling, there are associated greenhouse gases. When we look at all the waste that's generated, only about 35% of it is recycled or composted. And so when you look here at, this is the total, right, that is generated of 268 million tons. Of that, a quarter of it is paper and paperboard, which is recyclable generally. Glass is 4%, which is recyclable generally. Metals, 9%, almost 10%, which are generally recyclable. Plastics, 13%, generally recyclable. Yard trimmings, food waste are generally compostable, right? And then you can see that you have things like wood, which is probably things like construction debris, which are more difficult to recycle or compost, but can be done. Rubber and leather and textiles at 6%. And so of all of this material that we're producing, almost all of it is capable of either being recycled or composted. You know, we look here, we've got paper and paperboard, glass, metals, plastics, yard trimmings, food. All of this could easily be recycled or composted, right? If there were a market to do so, if it was economically viable. Some of this other stuff might be difficult to recycle or reuse. There's a lot of work being done on textiles, trying to figure out how we can better recycle textiles. But that stuff's a little bit more difficult. But again, that would only be 1.9, so 2, 7, 9, 13, that would be like 13% going into the landfill rather than us only saving 35% of it through recycling and composting. And again, this is in 2017, this is a few years ago, so it may be a little bit different now, in particular with the recent changes in how recycling is conducted. So I think we can all acknowledge that we have a problem with waste, right? We have finite capacity for burying our waste. We have limited ability to burn it for energy, right? Burning waste for energy is, in some cases, a good option, but there are only certain materials that you can do that with. So what can we do? How do we limit the impact of our consumptive choices on water quality, on landfill space, on greenhouse gas emissions? Well, tried and true 3 R's are really a good place to start. Reduce, reuse, and then recycle. And I do think that these are hierarchical, right? First choice being reduce or refuse. We'll talk about that in a minute. Second choice being reuse, repair, repurpose. And then the very last choice being recycle. Okay, and the reasons for that are because, again, like we've talked about, recycling comes with its own host of greenhouse gas emissions. So I like to start with reduce because to me, it's not just like trying to reduce the number of things I'm putting into the trash, right? For me, reduce also means to refuse and to rethink. So when I mean refuse, I mean to think about, do I need to buy this? Is this something that is a need or is it a want? If it's a want, is it something that is going to have a long life? Am I going to be able to reuse it? Am I going to be able to fix it if it breaks? Is it going to hold its value for a long time? Are there better options that might be more expensive now, but will save me money in the long run, right? So first thing to think about is, do I need to buy this? If you really decide, yep, gotta have it, wanna have it, okay, can I buy it secondhand? Has somebody already owned this, but maybe there's a refurbished version available? And what I mean by that is, especially when you're buying electronics, you can generally search for items where there was a problem maybe originally in the manufacturing, it was shipped to someone, didn't work quite right, went back to the company, they refurbished it, they're saying it's working now, but it's not in the original packaging. Could you buy the refurbished version, which works just as well, so that you're not consuming something entirely new? Is that item available with post-consumer materials? So could you buy it and it's made out of recycled plastics? If you're buying paper products, can you buy 100% post-consumer recycled paper products? If you are, things like building materials, you can sometimes find the types of building materials you need at places like Habitat for Humanity, the restores where they've rehabbed a home, maybe it had a perfectly good door in it, and you just need a new door for some reason. You can go to places like that to find those items. So the next kind of question to ask yourself is it durable and repairable? So is this an item that's going to last a long time? Can I fix it if it breaks? Story, real quick, a little anecdote about our hot water heater. Hot water heater stopped working. There was a tiny spring inside that that allowed the water to flow through the different valves. And one piece of that spring was made out of plastic, and the plastic broke. And we could not buy a replacement part for that little tiny spring. And so we had to get a whole new hot water heater. When we got a new hot water heater, we looked for one that didn't have that little plastic piece, so we knew that we'd be able to fix it if it broke again. So thinking about those kinds of repairable items, can I fix it if it breaks? Is this an item that tends to have planned obsolescence, right? And what I mean by that is, if you get a new phone and the software stops working about a month after the newest phone comes out, right? That's called planned obsolescence. Companies do that so that you buy the newest best thing. So am I buying something that if I needed to, I could update the software on it, make sure that it's going to, maybe you could choose something that's going to be, and again, some of these items might be a little bit more expensive at the beginning, but they're going to end up having greater longevity. Thinking about things like furniture, especially, I know it can be really easy to go, to a big box store and spend a little bit of money to get a new sofa. But what if you could find an antique sofa that you could reupholster, and then it could become a family heirloom piece, and it could continue moving through your family for generations. So think about things like that. Is it made with toxic substances? And when we say toxic substances, we mean things like plastics, petroleums, heavy metals. Or is it made in such a way that the workers or the environment that surround the manufacturing process are impaired by those types of chemicals? So is there something in the manufacturing of this item that is going to cause environmental decline or health problems for the people who are a part of that manufacturing process? And then the last question in the reduce, refuse, and rethink category is, can I avoid the packaging, right? This is one of my big ones. And this doesn't just mean, bringing your grocery bags with you when you go to the grocery store, because I think we all know that even when you go to the grocery store and bring your bags, you're still going to come home with 10 things covered in plastic. Think about clamshells that strawberries come in. I don't know why they like to do this, but sometimes if you try to buy an organic cucumber, it's going to come encased in plastic. So are there options for you to purchase that item where it's not surrounded in packaging? Is there a local farm that you can go purchase vegetables from? Is there a farmer's market where you can take all of your reusable bags and you don't have to get any of that packaging? So that's just kind of with food. With items, it's a little bit more difficult. I remember hearing a joke a long time ago about needing a pair of scissors to open the packaging for a pair of scissors, and that really stuck with me because everything really is kind of shrink wrapped, bubble wrapped. But you can generally find nowadays options where they've opted for lower packaging or more kind of eco-friendly packaging. So things like, instead of using a plastic bubble wrap envelope to ship things in, a lot of people are now shipping in these just extra padded paper envelopes that provide the same amount of protection for the products inside, but they can ultimately be recycled or burned or thrown in a composter because they're just paper. So can you find options that avoid the packaging? I know there are a lot of companies now out there that are doing things like packaging deodorants in cardboard tubes rather than in plastic tubes. And that's so that the plastic tubes don't end up being recycled or thrown in the bin, right? You can take that cardboard tube and you can recycle it, or you can tear it up and toss it in the compost. So are there ways that you can avoid packaging, or can you find packaging that can be more easily and more rapidly decomposed? The next R is to reuse, repurpose, or repair. And I really like this picture because somebody's answer actually to what brings them happiness was wine, and I would agree with that. And so you could save up your wine bottles and make a beautiful lamp like they have here, this wine chandelier. I've also seen, for all my gardeners out there, I love the garden beds that are ringed by wine bottles that are buried about halfway in the ground. So if you're crafty, if you have some space to kind of save things up for a project like that, that's a really great way to keep things out of the kind of recycling process that does have its own associated greenhouse gases. Can you repurpose items? So again, buy secondhand when possible. So go to a place where you can purchase things that have been used before, buy refurbished electronics like we talked about, and then repurpose them if you can. One of the things that we've been trying to do, and that I think is a really worthwhile endeavor, is if you can find a local charity that will take your old cell phone, they wipe it and then they give it for free to homeless individuals so that they can have access to the internet, to be able to communicate with folks. And so you can generally find organizations that will take those old cell phones rather than just ditch them, or maybe give them to an electronics recycler. You can actually have them repurposed and reused by someone else. Use items for another purpose. I have a sink in my front yard that is holding my aloe plants. As gardeners, as a lot of the folks in the webinar audience are, you can put plants in almost anything. Colanders are great. Like I said, I have a sink. I've seen bathtubs. I've seen cars. I've seen boats. I've seen any number of items repurposed into planters, into beds for plants. So that's a really great and creative option if you have that kind of will. Get broken items repaired. There is still a cobbler in my city. I could take my shoe and get it fixed. So that's something. Find those people who still have those skills, who can do those things. If your vacuum cleaner breaks, fix it. Take it to someone who can fix it, or watch a YouTube video and figure out how to fix it yourself. There are usually, and I know in particular here in Bradenton, we have a knife sharpener, a few knife sharpeners around. So instead of, buying a new set of knives because yours are getting dull and old, take them to a knife sharpener, get them kind of rehabbed. And then where you can't do these things, donate those functional goods to local nonprofit organizations. And I want to pinpoint here too local nonprofit organizations, because a lot of people kind of default to Goodwill or Salvation Army, and Salvation Army and Goodwill do great work, and they do great work within our communities, but there are lots of smaller nonprofit organizations as well that need these items, and they'll generally provide them to the communities that need them for free rather than selling them back to the community the way that Goodwill and Salvation Army do. So look for things like family resource centers, women's resource centers, shelters, homeless organizations, churches. Look for those kinds of groups that you could donate your used functional goods to. And that way you know that they're staying local and they're getting to the people that really need them at no cost to them. So the last kind of option is recycling, and I put compost on here, right? If you can compost either in your home or within your community, this is going to be a great way to lower your overall greenhouse gas emissions. Recycling is not the best option. There's a lot of emphasis on, I should say there was a long time there. I remember growing up, I'm going to date myself, but I remember growing up in the early 90s, and recycling was the big thing, right? It was all about recycling. And that was really pushed by, a few main organizations throughout the country really, trying to get that message across. And I think we all learned that recycling is great and we should all recycle. But we didn't really talk a lot about the associated greenhouse gases with the process of sorting those recyclables, transporting them to a facility where they can be melted down and remanufactured. And so again, remember that reducing and refusing those items that would end up being recycled is really the best first option. And then look for e-recycling, electronics recycling for broken electronic items. A lot of those can't go in, they're not gonna be able to go in your normal recycling. And if they end up going into a landfill, they have really valuable metals in them that can be repurposed, but they have to be broken down and separated out by somebody who knows what they're looking for. And that's what those electronics recyclers are really good at. There are a few organizations within the Tampa Bay area that do electronics recycling, and I would definitely recommend looking for those if you have something like a television or a computer that has croaked and you need to find a place for it. Look for an electronics recycler so that they can harvest those materials. When we talk about electronics, there's very intensive mining that goes on with the extraction of the original resource. So if we can you know, kind of get those materials out of our broken electronics and get them back into that cycle, that's going to lower the upstream greenhouse gases and associated environmental impacts with mining. Also, recognize that because of some of the recent changes in the recycling industry, right? Because recycling is a business, people sell recyclables and markets have changed. Some municipalities have changed their rules lately due to export challenges. So check with your local municipality, find out what they're actually doing with the recycling. You know, I've heard anecdotally from some folks around the state that they've talked to their local municipality and found out that while they're still collecting recyclables in a recycle bin, those items aren't ending up actually being recycled because there's no market for it. So check with your local municipality, find out what's going on, what things can be recycled, how clean they need to be in order for them to be recycled, and make sure that you're following the rules as far as what things can go in your bin. And then composting is really great. And we're going to talk a little bit about food waste in a minute. But for us, you know, a lot of us here in the webinar, we're gardeners. We recognize that the health of a garden starts with the soil. And one of the best ways that you can improve the health of your soil here in Florida is to compost and reintroduce organic material into that soil. And so, you know, I will just say composting is easy. There are many different ways that you can compost. You can compost in a bin like is pictured here. You can build your own bin. You can get a tumbler system. You can use worms. There are many, many different ways to compost. Here at Extension, we offer classes specifically on composting, and we will be happy to walk you through the process of setting up your own composting system. There are community composting programs out there as well. Some options for kind of taking your personal food waste and compost items. And then there are some areas where there are municipal composting programs as well. There are a few states in the United States that actually, a few cities within, mostly states on the West Coast, some in Midwest US and some in the East, but they have created actual mandates to folks that you cannot throw away your compostable goods in the general trash. You have to put them in a compost bin, and those items go to a municipal composting facility. And then you as a citizen get to go and pick up free compost. And so it's a really great option and a really great service. We don't have that capacity currently within our local community. So I really, really encourage you to look into composting. And again, don't be scared of it. It's not smelly. If you do it right, there won't be critters that you have to worry about. I mean, there will be critters, but there won't be critters you have to worry about. And you'll end up with a great soil supplement that you can add back into our soil. Let's see, there's a question in the Q&A. Okay. So I wanted to put in here a note on eco-friendly products, right? So as consumers, I think that we've all kind of developed a conscience lately regarding environmental friendliness. And we really want to search out items that we feel good about buying, right? We don't want to stop buying things, but we want to feel good about the things that we're buying. So don't think that the answer to sustainability is consumption, right? One of the main things that is going to lower our greenhouse gas emissions is the ability to consume less. So if you can refuse items, the best choice is always going to be to refuse that item rather than buying something that's quote unquote eco-friendly, right? Even though something is an eco-friendly product or is labeled as such, doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have associated greenhouse gases, that it's not going to end up in a landfill, or that it's any more durable or repairable or reusable than any other item. So think about the lifespan of that product. Really dig into what they're telling you on the label. I know, for instance, there are a lot of trash bags out there that are listed as being compostable trash bags, or disposable cutlery that's being listed as being compostable, right? It's made with corn plastics rather than petroleum plastic. But what you don't realize about those products is they're not compostable in a home composting system. They're only compostable in a high heat, large scale municipal composting system. They're not going to break down in a backyard bin. So understand that even though those items may claim to be compostable or may claim to be eco-friendly, do a little bit of research on those products before you spend more money on them. Because generally companies that are, marketing their products in such a way might be able to charge a little bit more for it, because people are wanting to support people who are taking steps that make us feel good. Beware of greenwashing. That's, this term that refers to something that is seen as environmentally friendly, but might not really have a lot of associated benefits. So again, make informed choices, and recognize that consumption is still consumption, and that there's still greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of any product, whether it's eco-friendly or not. And two kind of big additional considerations that I wanted to talk about associated with consumption and waste is, number one, food waste. We throw away so much food in this country. It's astonishing, really. The amount of food that goes to a grocery store and never ends up touching a person's plate is astronomical, because we have a certain set of expectations as to what that produce is supposed to look like, and we won't purchase it if it doesn't look that way. And so I would suggest to you that if you can, think about ways to reduce your food waste. Make sure that you are, to the best of your ability, use what you buy. I try to keep kind of a running tally in my head of the things that need to be used first. You can also write a list and put it on the fridge, use kale, use mushrooms before they go bad. And where possible, again, this is where composting is really great, because if you can keep that food waste out of the landfill, not only are you lessening just the amount of items that are going into the landfill, you are returning that carbon to the soil in the local environment, and you don't have the associated methane production that you get when food breaks down in an anaerobic environment. Because as this food waste goes into a landfill, right, it has a liner underneath it, it gets buried. That environment is very low oxygen, and as these foods break down, they produce methane. A lot of that methane in landfills ends up being burned off, but you're ending up with methane in the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas of major concern, because it actually has a higher warming potential than CO2 does. So that's kind of my note on food waste. Think critically too when you're buying food. Do you really need this much? Can you freeze it until you need to use it so it doesn't go bad? If you can, get a backyard chicken. They'll eat a lot of your food waste for you. think about, again, think about composting. It really does wonders on reducing your food waste. And then I wanted to kind of mention microplastics, because this is something that's been talked about more and more lately. And I think it's important to note that as we throw things away, right, not everything ends up making it to the landfill. Some things end up in our stormwater system. Those things then end up in our rivers, creeks, and out in our marine environment. And as plastic is kind of attacked by UV light, it breaks down into smaller and smaller parts, but it never ceases being plastic. It's always plastic, even when it's microscopic. And so what we're finding really consistently throughout the entire ecosystem is that microplastics are present in our fish, in human bodies. They're present in the bodies of animals that live in at the Arctic, at the two poles, because there's some evidence that microplastics get around via air currents as well as ocean currents. So where do these microplastics come from? They come from things that we either put in the recycle bin or in the trash that end up flying out of the back of something here and there, or somebody just chucks it out their window, it ends up on the street. Or even more insidiously, you could be just doing your laundry. And as you wash your clothing that contains polyfibers, those polyfibers end up, they shed some of those polyfibers, and then that water ends up, going into the municipal water system to be cleaned and then flushed out into our local water bodies. So we have a lot of microplastics that are coming from our clothing. They're coming from the breakdown of garbage that just doesn't end up where it's supposed to. But we as consumers can really stem the tide of the plastics that are getting into our environment if we just stop buying so many plastic and disposable items. And so there's been a really big push on things like plastic straws, plastic cups, Ziploc bags, all of those types of things that are one-use items. How do we stop using single-use plastic? What can we do to encourage the use of items that aren't going to just be used once and chucked in a bin? And so that's my kind of last bit on microplastics and food waste. We could talk about consumption probably a lot more. But there's, again, just go back to the tried and true, reduce, reuse, recycle, but think about it also as reduce, refuse, reuse, repurpose, and repair, and then recycle or compost. And really composting is where we want to get to. There are some resources here. If you've never been there, I would highly recommend the Story of Stuff. storyofstuff.org. You can watch videos. They have these great cartoon videos on the life of a plastic water bottle, the life of a piece of clothing. It really, they break down from extraction to consumption and the recycling process in a way that's really accessible, not just to adults, but also to kids. So I definitely recommend checking out the storyofstuff.org and looking at some of the videos that they have available. There are some interesting articles out there regarding import policies and what they mean for our current status of recycling in the different states in the country. So I would recommend looking around to find out what's going on kind of locally. Think about fast fashion. Think about, do you really need a new bathing suit just because it's a new year? And where those clothes are coming from. Look at the tag of where your clothes are made. Think about the greenhouse gas emissions associated just with the transportation of those items. And then, get involved in some local cleanup efforts. I know that in Sarasota County, there's a microplastics awareness campaign that's been going on, and throughout kind of the state of Florida, there are a few groups doing some awareness building on microplastics. So look around for things like that. And again, we'll be hosting another one of these webinars next week, and we will be talking about water. We'll be talking about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with water consumption and transportation, and we'll be talking about water quality. And then in the last series, the week following, we'll be talking about landscape. We'll be talking specifically about choices you make in your home landscape and how they impact our greenhouse gas emissions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A now. Otherwise, I just want to give a shout out to these ladies. They are the originators of the Climate Smart curriculum. They are all at the University of Florida. If you're interested in the Climate Smart Floridians program, feel free to email them. There were a lot of resources for today's information. If you're interested in seeing the entire list, feel free to email me and I will give it to you in a bigger text. And as always, if you have landscape related questions, you want to know what that bug is, email manateemg@gmail.com and we will be happy to answer your questions. Let's see, I had one question pop in. Okay, all right. That was just a clarification on a comment from earlier. Awesome. Thank you all for a great day and keep up the good work.